Right. Okay. We'll make a start. Hello, everyone that's here. Right. So today I'm going to be I'm going to be covering, kind of finishing off what we did a couple of weeks ago. I know last week we didn't have a session for various reasons. But the week before that, we started to look at Macbeth, specifically the context, followed by a little bit of language and structural analysis of specifically the witches in character. But this week, I thought we kind of finish off what we were doing and link those things together and look at how you could maybe answer a question based on the witches. Linking it to the context because in your exam you get marked on linking it to context. You get 6 out of 30 marks. In fact, a fifth of the marks is for context specifically. And then for the second half, I thought I'll start to look at the character of Macbeth. And I'm going to start to break it down act by act. And we're going to look at specifically Act 1 today and how his character develops from the very beginning of the play towards the end. And I'm going to start to break that down. But the thought I thought we'd do to begin with is I'm going to put a task on based on the key words or some new vocabulary that we have been looking at over the past few sessions. So 2 weeks ago, I gave you that huge list of the accumulation of all the words that we have started to learn. And I want to keep jogging your memories and jogging your minds because new vocabulary is extremely important when it comes to English, not just for your exams, but in real life. It's good to have a range of vocab. But then when it comes to your exams specifically, when you do the creative writing question, and it's usually worth a large proportion of the marks. So for AQA and EdExcel, it will be worth half the marks. You get marked on using a range of unique vocabulary. So I've chosen 10 out of the 20 that we have been over, and I've given you a little exercise. And I'm going to give you a few minutes to have a go at this, and then I'll put on the answers. But do your best. It's fine if you don't know them all, but I'm just trying to encourage you to use these outside of class as well as just me giving you them because I think they'll be very useful. So I'll give you a few minutes just to have a look at these whilst we wait for other people to join as well. Right. Okay. Let's start looking through these. It's always good just to recap vocabulary and recap on the things we have been doing. And I can't stress enough how important it is that I encourage you to start using these words outside of class because having a range of vocabulary will really help you later down the line, not just in exams, but in general life. Okay, so I'll put the answers on. So, number one, then, the abandoned hospital has an eerie silence. So, if we think back to the definition of eerie, it's something that's ominous, quite scary. So, it makes sense in this context. Despite her multiple failures, she remained resilient and refused to give up on her dream. So, resilience, pretty much self-explanatory as to what's said in the sentence. It's a refusal to give up, basically, a refusal to stop doing what you love. And his adamant refusal to apologize made the situation even more tense. So if you're adamant, it's again kind of very similar. You're a bit stubborn and you don't want to admit that you're wrong or maybe give up on your argument. The detective noticed a sinister pattern in the suspect's behavior that raised serious concerns. So sinister being something that's maybe potentially evil if we think back, um, something to maybe cause concern if we're thinking about behavior. So this could be, since it's linked to the detective, it could be in the crime genre. It could be thinking about a villain or a criminal who's got very sketchy behavior, potentially evil intent or malintent. She gave a tentative smile, unsure whether her answer was correct. So if you do something tentatively, you do something with hesitance, you're not sure if you're correct, you do something with worry. So it's kind of like a hesitancy. You're worried about doing something. After the performance, the applause seemed to linger in the auditorium long before or after the curtains closed. So lingering, lots of things can linger, and it's a lovely thing to use metaphorically because even in this example, it's talking about sound. Sounds can linger. They can last for long periods of time. Smells can linger. We could use it in a metaphorical sense when we talk about memories. Perhaps you're feeling nostalgic. You're looking at a childhood toy and you're thinking about how the emotions linger in the room and how the sadness lingers, maybe. The desert town was completely desolate, with no sounds of life or movement. So again, pretty self-explanatory. Desolate is without life, um, as it pretty much says there. And this feeling of emptiness, basically, of being alone. His meticulous planning ensured that no detail of the presentation was overlooked. So if you're meticulous, you want to do everything down to the detail, you want to do everything correctly. You really put your time and effort into making sure everything is perfect about what you're doing. I think about a month ago when we first looked at the word meticulous, we looked at it in the context of our character was meticulously folding the letter or writing the letter because it matters to him. So when you do something meticulously, it's because it matters to you. The vibrant colors of the painting brought the entire room to life. So vibrancy is energy, it's life. So here it's talking about colors. So it could be bright colors, it could be bright reds and golds, silvers, blues. But vibrancy can be linked to people as well. People could have high energy, they could come with a joy and a happiness and just bring life into the room. So again, vibrancy is a lovely thing to use in a metaphorical sense as much as it is literal. And when she received the scholarship letter, she was absolutely elated. So we can work that one out. Elated is pure joy and ecstasy. To feel elated is to be extremely happy. So just as you would if you opened your exam results and you got all nines, which is what we hope for, you'd be elated, you'd be over the moon. Okay, so again, just good to recap. So this is the full list. We won't go through these right now. We went through them a couple of weeks ago. But if you didn't manage to screenshot or take them back then, this is your opportunity again. But there's some lovely words here, and we're going to start adding to these now before we move on to the witches. But these are some lovely, it's an eclectic range of words. Some very high level words. So if you use these in the exam, you'd be getting higher marks. So I'd recommend using some of these words. Okay. So just a reminder, a couple of weeks ago, thank you to everyone who did send me some stuff. Again, this is optional. You don't have to do it, but I think it would help. A few people did send some stuff, and I appreciate that. I've not marked it. So if you are here and you're thinking, why have I not handed it back to you yet? I haven't had time. I will get to it this week. I do have some free time. But if you want to send me stuff, there's still time. And I'm happy to mark anything English related that you want to send me. I'm always free to do it. Again, we had a comprehensive reading task based on the short story of The Monkey's Paw. Thank you again to people who sent me them. If you want to send me them, feel free. My door is always open to mark things that you need me to mark. Okay, um, this was an option for the homework, was to go through that short story and basically find these words and work out what they mean. And I'm just going to go through them now. I think we can add them to our comprehensive list of new words. Again, there's some lovely words here. I'm not going to do any sort of task. I'm just going to give you the definitions. And feel free to screenshot and take them. And I would encourage you to do that. So these were the answers to the homework. So if you provoke somebody, it is to make somebody deliberately and with intention angry or upset, or give them some sort of negative feelings. You might have heard it in the context of, you might have, when you were younger, had an argument with your siblings, and you tend to provoke your siblings. You purposely try and wind them up. So that'd be a good sort of synonym for winding somebody up, would be to provoke. It's a bit of a high level way of saying that. The adverb of amiably, if you to do something amiably, you do it because you care. You do it because you're nice and it's in a friendly manner. You could also describe somebody with the adjective of that they are amiable, meaning that they're friendly, that they're kind, that they're generous, all that. Again, the adverb grimly. If you were to do something in a grim way, it's often something a bit more serious and unpleasant. They have these very negative connotations. Um, think about a really dark day when it's really chucking it down with rain and it's really cloudy in the sky. You might describe that as being a very grim vibe of a day. So if you do to do something grimly, it would be to do something very gloomy, something very negative. Okay, so if you were Doti, you're brave and determined, especially in difficult situations. So yeah, kind of very similar to resilience. It's along the same wavelength of sticking at something, even when it's difficult, even when it's hard to do so. But the difference here is that you do it with bravery. You really put one foot in front of the other and you really give it your best shot. Okay, credulity. This is when we have a tendency to believe things way too easily. So it's basically a synonym for being gullible. You believe things without proof, without evidence, and you just take people's word for it without even questioning it, really. Talisman. If you were writing a potential Gothic story, if you were writing a supernatural story, you might use this noun of the talisman. It's a thing. It's when we have an object that's believed to have some sort of magical powers that either bring you luck, protection, give you strength. It basically just has magical powers. Scurrying is a lovely verb. It's to move quickly with short, hurried movements. And we tend to use this more for animals because a lot of animals sort of skitter and scurry away. Think sort of like mice, rats, um, those small sort of animals like that. They tend to scurry. And it's because they do so with fear or as long as they do it quickly. And this would be a lovely opportunity to, again, kind of personify, if you were to write a short story, link it to humans. Because humans don't tend to scurry, but it'd be an interesting choice of verb if you were to use it, because it would have anthropomorphic or animalistic imagery related to it. Okay, if you were to do something apathetically, you would do so without interest or enthusiasm or concern. You basically don't care about what you're doing. If something is pulsating, this might be familiar in terms of biology. Think about the word pulse comes from the heartbeat, which is blood around the body. We can feel our pulse around our body. And when we say something is pulsating, it's giving this imagery of the blood moving around the body. So it's expanding and contracting rhythmically. And again, it's a lovely one to use metaphorically in terms of imagery, because many things can be described as pulsating. But when we use that word, it makes the reader think about the body, it makes the reader think about the blood and the heart. So having those connotations makes it lovely to use metaphorically. Stealthy. If you were to be stealthy, you'd be quiet and secretive. On the same wavelength, you could use the adverb and say you could do something stealthily, which again, to be doing something quietly and secretively, trying not to be noticed. So think about a spy or, yeah, there's a spy on a mission and he's trying not to be observed by the public. or by the enemy. They might want to be stealthy and hide themselves away. Okay, and then a fusillade is a rapid and continuous series of shots, explosions, or attacks. So if you were to write a story about war or a battle, potentially, you might use this noun. It's a thing. Okay, so I hope we can add these and expand our list of new words because there's some lovely grade 8, 9 words here that you'd be getting the higher marks for, and it would be a shame for you not to use them. So again, I encourage you to use them outside of the class, please. Okay. But today, let's move back on to Macbeth. So people who've joined since I started, what I am going to do is a couple of weeks ago, we made a start on the language analysis and the context of Macbeth. And I really want to carry this sort of like topic and module through because a lot of people have asked me for Macbeth. And I really want to deliver on that because I get that it's not an easy text. It's hard to understand and interpret the language. And I want to make it a bit easier for you all. I want to be able to give you answers for exams. I want to be able to help you. So I want to revisit what we did on the language and structure of the witches, and I want to add what we did on the context back into that. And then in the second half, I want to bring it back round and I want to start on the character of Macbeth, specifically Act 1. Okay, but let's do a quick recap on the context so that we can stimulate our brains to remember what we did, because that's been a while, it's been 2 weeks. So do you remember we talked about the tragic genre and what that meant? So the tragic genre deals primarily with human suffering and conflict on a moral level, as we'll see when we look at Macbeth. And it focuses on the downfall of a character. In this case, our protagonist is Macbeth. And this could be due to aspects of fate, so the witches, or it could be due to personal flaws. And that's what we're going to start to look at today and start to make a debate as to whether we think fate or free will is the cause of Macbeth's downfall. And the purpose, the reason the writer does this is to evoke pity. It's supposed to teach the audience something about life. So it focuses on these themes of the supernatural and again, this fate and free will, sometimes ambition, guilt, power, morality, human psychology, violence, and even this appearance versus reality when things aren't exactly what they seem. Okay, so we looked at the elements of a tragic genre, specifically a tragic hero. So Macbeth is our tragic hero, and all that means is he is our central character whose journey we follow. He begins at the start of the play as someone who's very noble, who's well liked, who's praised even, except he is, like every human, flawed for whatever reason. And in this case, it's ambition. He is overwhelmed by his desire to kill the king so that he can become king. And that is his flaw as a human being. And because of that flaw, he undergoes a fall from grace. He begins really high, he's praised, and in the end, he dies for the simple reason that he is flawed because he followed his ambition. And that is what defines the journey of a tragic hero. And then we have some key words within that we can start to look at. So, for example, the hamartia of our noble tragic hero, Macbeth, is his flaw. So in this case, it's ambition. So if you were to write an essay, you could say Macbeth's hamartia is ambition, or his desire for power. Hamartia just means a flaw. It's a fancy word for that, but it's good to get that into an exam because you get marked on terminology. So it would show your understanding of not only key terminology, which is AO2, but context at AO3. Hubris is pride, and Macbeth shows a lot of excessive pride. And we'll start to see this when we look at him today. We could even argue that his hamartia, his flaw, is hubris, it's excessive pride, and that's why he commits the crime of regicide and kills the king. Then there is the peripeteia. Now, this is the moment in a play where our hero undergoes some sort of change in fate. They change as a character, as a person. And I would argue that in Macbeth, and this is up to debate, this is also up to you, but a lot of people, including me, believe that it's Act 3, Scene 4. It's the moment that Macbeth sees Banquo's ghost. This is the peripeteia. It's that reversal of fortune when things flip. It's the moment where the fate of our character is irreversible. There's nothing he can do. He can no longer be saved by God. He can no longer undergo salvation. He's fixed. His fate is fixed, and that is what peripeteia is. Catastrophe is the final act of suffering. So in this case, at the very end of the play, Macduff kills Macbeth, and that is our catastrophe. And then we have catharsis. Catharsis kind of refers to the feeling that the audience gets. So when Macbeth actually dies, we're supposed to feel pity. We're supposed to feel sorry for him. We're supposed to feel quite sad when he dies. And the reason that is because throughout the play, we've come to know him so well and we followed his journey that we understand him as a character. We understand his mentality, his ambitions, why he did what he did. And so by the end, we just feel sorry for him. Um, and we understand his tragic downfall. And therefore, because we feel sorry for him, we learn our lesson as well, not to tempt fate, not to sin, essentially. Okay, so a bit of a context recap, and I'll try and keep this short. If you want the full context lesson, we did this 2 weeks ago. It should still be on YouTube. You should still have access to it. I'm not going to go over in too much detail today. I'm just going to briefly go over the context, so we can start linking it to the quotes. But firstly, Holinshed Chronicles. Now, this is the original source material for Macbeth. Shakespeare did not write Macbeth. He did not come up with the story. As hard as that is to believe, he did not write this. He wrote the play, don't get me wrong, but he did not write the original story of Macbeth. The Holinshed Chronicles is supposed to be a historical text, although that's debatable whether it's true or not. And it's depicting the history of English and Scottish rulers. And there is a story in there about a king called Macbeth, except Shakespeare makes several changes to the story, and for good reason as well. So the first one being that in the original story, Macbeth is supposed to be quite a kind ruler, and he rules for 10 years with no problems. Except in our story, in our play of Macbeth, he becomes very tyrannous very quickly. He starts to undergo his downfall pretty much immediately from when we meet him, compares to his slow 10-year rule in the original story. That is for a reason. That's because it's accelerating his tyranny. It's accelerating his journey so that we as an audience can understand his flaw as a person. It's emphasizing the moral message of our play, which we'll come into when we look at the Divine Right of Kings, should give us the moral message. But there is a second thing. Shakespeare changes in the play. We look at Banquo. That is Macbeth's best friend in the play. In the original story, Banquo is actually part of the villainous behavior. He's part of killing the King Duncan. Except in Shakespeare's story, Banquo is actually the good guy. He's painted very much as Macbeth's opposite. And that is, again, for a reason. By placing all of this emphasis on Macbeth's tyranny, of his villainous behavior, it really emphasizes, again, that moral message of the play. It opens up this debate as to whether it's the witch's fault, or whether it's his fault, or is it Lady Macbeth's fault, or is it just simply because Macbeth is a bad person? And so by really placing the focus on Macbeth and putting him as the sole character of villainy, it really opens up the moral message of is sinning a bad thing, or were our fates already predetermined before the play? And we'll look at that today. But it was done for a reason. Okay, and the divine right of kings then. So this is a really key thing to remember about Macbeth, about the time. So at the time, in England, people believed that the king or the queen was chosen by God. They believed that the king or the queen had divine authority. Everything they said was direct from God. So to go against the king or the queen was not just a law-breaking, illegal thing to do, but it would quite literally go against religion. It would be a blasphemous thing to do. So people never went against the king or the queen. It just wasn't a thing. It was a sin, as much as it was a crime. So in the play, when Macbeth kills Duncan, it's not just a legal crime of murder, it's very much a religious one as well. And it's there to teach us about, again, the moral message of the play. We even see the consequences of this. When he kills Duncan, the world becomes out of whack. We see strange weather. We see animals behaving weirdly. We see chaos. And that is because Macbeth has broken this divine right of kings, which he should not have done. And at the time, that would have very much shocked an audience because they believed very heavily in this. They believed that divine punishment would come for anyone who challenged the king or the queen. That very strongly links to the Great Chain of Being. It's kind of almost one and the same idea. So the Great Chain of Being is this idea that at the time there was a hierarchy, a divine cosmic hierarchy. So at the top, there was God. Below him, there were the angels. Below them, there was the king or the queen. Below him or her, there was all the nobles. And then there was all the common people, animals, plants, and rocks. And everyone had their place within this God-given hierarchy. And if you were to try and transcend that place and overstep your boundaries, you would literally see chaos in the world. So again, the strange weather, the animals behaving weirdly, the violent behavior, disorder, whether that's political or whatever, you would see some sort of chaos because you couldn't transcend your place in the world. And Macbeth does transcend his place. By killing the king, he becomes king when he should not be king. And that is him transcending his place. So we'll look at this as well. Okay, demonology, King James I. King James I believed very heavily in witchcraft. He even wrote a book about it called Demonology. And he linked the witches to Satan, to evil behavior. He thought that they very much opposed the great chain of being. They weren't supposed to be on this earth. Um, he undertook a voyage. This is a really key thing to remember. In 1590, where he went to collect his new bride who'd become the Queen of Scotland. And on his journey, his boat was almost sunk by bad weather, and he blamed that on witches. He thought that witches or evil forces were trying to kill him in order to get to God, essentially. And so, because of this, one of the largest witch hunts in all of recorded history happened because he came back to England and he basically tortured and killed loads of women. And yeah, so this play includes witches. And again, we'll kind of look at this when we recap the witches in a minute. But he killed and tortured 70 people because of this event. So the whole play, the reason we have witches is it appeals to the king. It teaches this moral message. Don't play with fire, otherwise you're going to get burnt. It's basically the moral message of this play. Okay, quickly whiz over the rest. So the witches are plot devices as well. Not only do they reveal the social fear at the time by representing disorder, but they serve a dramatic purpose. They are the ones who tell Macbeth what his life is going to be. They spur him into doing these evil things. And it's important to remember, and we will come back onto this, they never at any point tell him to do anything bad. They never at all tell him to murder Duncan. They never tell him to do it. But they do manipulate him into doing it. There's a slight difference. They never ever explicitly tell him to do anything, but they do spur him to do it, let's say, by giving him the prophecies. So they play an important role in pushing along the plot. So again, it's this debate of, is it their fault, or was Macbeth already an evil person to begin with? Was it fate, or was it free will that caused Macbeth to do what he did? And you can link the witches to Greek mythology. This is idea of the fates. What they did in Greek mythology is they would kind of determine the fates of humans. Except, again, Shakespeare changes this concept. Unlike the fates, our witches cannot directly cause something to happen. But what they can do is influence it to happen. What they can do is manipulate in things to happen. And it's what they do. So they have very limited power in what they can do. So it's worth remembering that as we go through. Act 3, Scene 5 was not originally in this play. It was added or is thought to be added as a later addition. It wasn't in the original version of Shakespeare's play, but was added many years later. And there's a reason for this. I mean, we think it has a very different tone to the original play. There's an introduction of a new character very suddenly who never appears again. So there's many reasons why people think this was added in. But it does serve a purpose, in all fairness. It makes the witches more sinister. It kind of allows the audience to understand their role and what they actually want out of Macbeth. And it just kind of adds to our pity for our character. So it is worth having this scene in because it does foreshadow the tyranny and violence that comes later in the play. It serves the moral message, and we'll come back onto this when we look at a quote from that scene. But it shows us that overconfidence, that hubris of pride, that hamasha of ambition is dangerous in the hands of humans. Okay, we'll skip religion for now because it's less prevalent for today. But gender, at the time, gender was a massive thing. Uh, England was very much a patriarchal society. Um, Men ruled. Men were kind of defined by their dominant behavior, whereas women were supposed to be obedient and silent. Whereas in this play, it very much plays on this idea of gender. We won't look at it today, but Lady Macbeth is a great example of this. She is absolutely nowhere near this obedient, silent domestic woman. In fact, she very much transcends this idea and manipulates Macbeth. She even chastises him for his masculinity, calling him weak, and she manipulates his masculinity. Even the witches are not your traditional female characters, and that links to this great chain of being. And even Macbeth, his masculinity is preyed upon. There's this debate of what defines a man of those times. And again, we'll look more at this specifically. And then finally, let's look at the four humors then. So there's this idea that the body at the time, you could split into four humors, the blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And each one of those things would link to a specific personality trait. Uh, if you were high in blood, you were kind of happy and optimistic. If you were high in yellow bile, you were angry, full of ambition. If you were high in black bile, you were sad and introspective. And if you were high in phlegm, you were calm and unemotional. And we kind of see this come up throughout the play, various things. And again, they're not so prevalent for today's lesson, so we will kind of brush over them, but we will see them when it comes to Lady Macbeth, because there is a point in Act 1, Scene 5, where she actively tries to change the balance of her four humors. And she tries to get rid of her blood and encourage yellow bile. She tries to become angry and basically get rid of her feminine traits and replace them with the more violent masculine traits. So they do come up, but not so prevalently today. Okay, so a quick reminder then, what's expected of you when it comes to the exam of Macbeth. Now, I assume most of you are doing AQA, and even if you're not, they're very similar mark schemes. So in paper one, you will be given an extract from somewhere in the play. You won't know beforehand. It will be very much on the day. And you're expected to start with that extract, do some analysis, some language and structure, and answer whatever question it gives you. And I put an example one here. So I think this was 2023. We're starting with this conversation. Explore how far Shakespeare presents Macbeth as a male character who changes in the play. Now, more often than not, the question will be either on character or theme. This one is kind of a bit of both. I've yet to see any other characters come up who aren't Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, but that's not to say that they won't, because technically Banquo and the Witches are both on the syllabus of things that could come up, but they'll be very mean to give you Banquo, I think. But the Witches we're doing today. And yeah, so it would be 30 marks. Split into AO1, which is making points. AO2 is your language and structural analysis. So it's key here to say, please use terminology, because even though this isn't English language, we still need to be using terminology. So our personification, our metaphors, all of that, please. And then 6 marks for context. A fifth of it is linking to this contextual idea. And then for Macbeth specifically, you also do get marked on spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Okay, we'll skip on that. Okay, so brief remembrance about the witches' structure. So, unlike the rest of the play, the witches do not speak in iambic pentameter. Most people in the play do. So, for example, most noble characters speak in this sort of 10-syllable unstressed rhythm, but the witches do not. They speak in rhyme and riddle. And we call that trochaic tetrameter rather than iambic. So, for example, our double double, toil and trouble, fire burn, and cauldron bubble. So our rhyming couplets. And the reason this is purely because it mimics the sort of sound of spells and chants, and it links to our context more than anything else. It presents them as unnatural. They shouldn't belong on this earth because they don't correspond to everyone else who is speaking in our normal iambic pentameter. So it really isolates them as characters, showing you how they are against the great chain of being. And the effect on the audience of this is it reflects societal fears, basically. It shows the audience that the supernatural powers of the witches are very much real, or what they believed at the time is that they were real. And their chant-like language contrasts with the ordered speech of the nobles, which symbolizes chaos versus order, so our breaking of the great chain of being. And it also makes them memorable, more than, as well as anything else, showing them as very much manipulators of fate. They are not our fate, so they do not directly control or tell us what to do, but they can manipulate and influence humanity into doing things. Okay. So we're going to start to look at this question. We won't come up with a direct answer to it. You can do it if you want to do it. Again, this is optional, but if you want to send me something, this would be a lovely question because this hasn't come up before in exams, but the witches very much could come up in exams. So it could be a question like this. Explain how Shakespeare presents the witches as strange but powerful in Macbeth. So they only appear 4 times, if we remember back. First is Act 1, Scene 1, where they open the play. And we'll look at a few quotes from that. But it's important that they open the play because they already introduce a chaotic atmosphere. And it's in Act 1, Scene 3 that Macbeth meets the witches for the first time. Him and Banquo encounter them on a heath, on a stormy heath, where they give him prophecies, telling him that he's going to be the Thane of Cawdor, the Thane of Glamis, and the king. And that is the inciting incident that sparks his ambition going forward in the play. And we'll come back onto this when we look in the next half about Macbeth. But if you want to take these quotes, again, this is a little reflectance on what we did 2 weeks ago. So if you didn't get the opportunity to take them then, please take them now, because these will come in handy in a few years' time when you do your exams. Let's give you a second to take them if you want them. Okay. So this is what we did 2 weeks ago. We looked at specifically the language and structure of these quotes. So this one's from Act 1, Scene 1. Where shall we meet? Where shall we 3 meet again in thunder, lightning, or in rain? So you can see an example of our rhyming sort of couplets here. We talked about the rhetorical questions, the pathetic fallacy, and the rule of 3, and what the language analysis actually meant in terms of explaining these quotes. So, for example, the rhetorical question creates that sense of unease. It's not normal. It's not what other characters would have done. So therefore, it creates this sense of mystery, suggests they're planning something beyond the normal human understanding, and therefore draws the audience into their world, implying that they have some sort of control over future events. So therefore, establishing them as a manipulative evil force. Because it's not normal to use rhetorical questions, and the fact that they do really sets them apart. It makes the audience really heavily aware of them as characters and how different and chaotic they are. The pathetic fallacy, again, this sort of like gloomy, stormy weather is almost metaphorical to represent disorder and chaos in the natural world. It shows the audience from the very first scene that there's going to be some sort of disturbances in the world, and therefore foreshadow the ominous tone and the violence and the crimes that are going to come later in the play. So it's, again, sets them up as sort of manipulators of fate, this evil force. And then very similar to the rhetorical question, we've got a rule of 3, which again is not a normal thing to use, so it really does set them apart from the other characters, basically. And it emphasizes the intensity of the storm. It builds a dramatic rhythm and reinforces the idea that natural forces are being disturbed. But how would we link this to context? Because this is what we're kind of going to do in the next 20 minutes before we move on. I'm going to try and do this as quick as possible. So this is what I would do. So I'd take those quotes and I'd really start to think about them in terms of the historical significance. So in terms of the witches in general, We kind of brushed this and we talked about this in detail a couple of weeks ago, but King James I really hated witches. He believed that they were real and therefore the people of England thought they were real. So not only does their existence flatter the king, but it introduces the moral message of the play. It shows the audience not to sin. Don't follow evil characters because chaos will come and it could lead to potential death. So don't betray your God-given place on earth. So this context is significant in terms of the witches because it sets up what the audience are supposed to learn. It also shows them as plot devices. They're there to set the opening tone of the play, introduce ambiguity, blur the line between free will and fate, so that we have to understand and work out ourselves who is to blame. Is Macbeth inherently evil, or are the witches to blame? That is for us to decide, and it is set up very nicely. It's established in Act 1, Scene 1. Again, linking to the Holinshed Chronicles, the original story was that they could pretty easily manipulate and tell people what to do, but not in Shakespeare's version. They were not the fates. All they can do is influence and manipulate. So it kind of sets them up as evil forces. But again, very important to note, they never tell Macbeth exactly what to do. They only hint. And then the Great Chain and the Divine Order. It's as simple as them breaking the Great Chain. They are going against the natural order of what the world should be. And that acts as the moral message of the play. They're directly opposing this natural, divine, God-given order, therefore presenting them as satanic worshippers of the devil. And that's exactly what King James I would have wanted. He wanted to teach his subjects and the people of England that witches were real, and he wanted to scare them. And this would have been a beautiful way to do that. So it kind of foreshadows the impending imagery. We then looked at, again, Act 1, Scene 2, when the battle's lost and won, fair is foul and foul is fair. And we looked at sort of oxymoronic structure of that line. Something can't be fair and foul at the same time. So I think, again, we could link this to context, specifically the Great Chain of Being. Just the structure of that sentence in general, it doesn't quite feel right. You know, as an audience member, I would feel very unsettled. I would feel quite, I don't know, uncertain about that. And so the fact that it sounds unnatural kind of presents the witches as being unnatural. It really shows the audience that they are not part of this world and they are there to create chaos. So therefore adding into our fate versus free will. We sort of have this fricative alliteration to add into that. We know we only really use fricative sounds that are harsh, and they're harsh because they're supposed to make you feel the intensity of the message. They tend to be used in terms of violent situations. And so the fact that Shakespeare has used this fricative alliteration really reinforces the witch's evil. And therefore the spell-like and unnatural feel of their language. And altogether foreshadows impending doom because they are against the natural chain of being. And then the chiasmus. So this is when we get a mirrored structure. Basically, if you weren't here 2 weeks ago, chiasmus is a mirrored structure. So the example here is fair is foul, foul is fair. If you were to put a mirror right in the middle of the two, right in the middle, it would reflect and it would look symmetrical. And that's all chiasmus is that symmetrical reflected structure. And the reason we have this is it reflects how the world of Macbeth is inverted and therefore corrupted. So right and wrong, truth or lies, and they're all becoming indistinguishable, therefore highlighting that the witches are influencing the reversal of the natural order. And we can link this to context again. So, for example, we talked about the Great Chain, the divine rights. It hints at the collapse of the natural and moral order. Inverting this fair and foul symbolizes the breakdown of kingship, loyalty, justice, key fears in what we call the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, where the king was attempted to be overthrown and blown up in Parliament. And if witches can make good seem evil, it makes the audience wonder what else might they be able to corrupt. And to a Jacobean audience, it suggests that the witches will lead Macbeth astray. And therefore that makes them feel very scared, or should make you feel quite worried and scared for Macbeth. Except again, they can't directly do it, but they can only influence him. And they can change his perception of reality. They operate outside of the human and divine order, and they are a violation against God's will. They work quite heavily as plot devices. They set the tone for the play. They open the play, purposefully creating an ominous tone to reflect the chaos that is to come. They introduce key themes: appearance versus reality, ambition, things that are going to carry out throughout the rest of the play and become motifs. They create tension. Like I said, they should make you feel very scared and worried for our character. They should guide your interpretation of the events that are going to happen, and they should act as a moral compass, a moral lesson of what not to do. Do not play with fire because you will get burnt. In the same way, do not follow the witches because they are supernatural evil forces, therefore, they will lead to chaos and disruption of the natural earth. And then we could link the fair is foul, foul is fair to this idea of religion. They completely invert Christian morality, which was key to Jacobean life. In Christianity, good and evil were clearly separated. We have God versus Satan, and I'm sure in many other religions it's very much the same. Um, but the witches kind of blend this idea. We don't really know whether they are evil completely or what they are. It's never really stated or explained what they are. So there's always this ambiguity going throughout the play. And that adds to the mystery. It adds to the moral message of fate versus free will, because we're not supposed to know whose fault it is. The whole point of this play is that we, as an audience, make our own judgment about whether Macbeth is in the right or wrong, and whose fault it is. And so this ambiguity really adds to that. Um, so this subversion of the moral order aligns with how James I viewed witches in demonology in his book. He viewed them as agents of Satan, whose goal was deception and chaos. And audiences at that time would very much see this line as evidence that witches um, were real, because they wouldn't just speak in riddles, but lies and twisting truth into evil. And then we could link again the fair is foul, foul is fair to this idea of gender. They're breaking the great chain by not following the typical ideas of a woman of that time. Um, they're going against the anti-patriarchal views of the time. So their cryptic, disorderly language and rejection of clarity mirror how they define not only moral norms, but gender roles as well. As women who wield influence outside the domestic or social sphere. And they're symbolically, therefore, monstrous. They don't belong in this world, not in power, but in logic and values. Okay. So, Act 1, Scene 3, then, is the first time that Macbeth and Banquo encounter the witches. Um, and Banquo's initial response to seeing the witches and receiving the prophecies is that they are so withered and wildly dressed, they look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on it. You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. So what he's really saying here is he's commenting on the way they look. He's commenting on the fact that they don't look human, essentially. He's saying they look nothing like humans should look. They don't look anything like typical women. I mean, they have physical beards. He's saying that you should be women. It's this idea of contextually, people had specific ideas of how women should look and behave. And he's saying you should be a woman, but you don't look woman. You don't even look like a human. And I'm confused on what you are. He even directly mentions their chaos. He says they're withered and wildly dressed. This they symbolize the unnatural disorder and chaos. Through the adjective of withered, it implies connotations of decay and age and the unnatural. So much so that nature has quite literally turned on them. They don't follow the traditional womanly looks. The adverb of the wildly implies chaos. If someone does something wildly, they do it in a very disordered and chaotic manner. And it reflects, therefore, the disruption and their unpredictability. Even the idea of the beards become a symbol of masculinity. When we associate beards, we think about men. Just biologically, men are the ones that grow beards more easily. And so the fact that these women in the play have beards is symbolic of, again, this disorder. They don't go with the great chain of being, they very much transcend it. And that kind of creates confusion in our audience. It reflects the inversion of natural order. Then we get this juxtaposition. It highlights the irony. So Earth, they don't look like humans, but are on our Earth. So this kind of contrast of ideas really paints their chaos. It really paints them as manipulators, because it highlights the irony. They are liminal figures. They don't belong here. They look somewhat like us, but they're not us. So it really creates confusion in the audience. Creates questions of who and what are these women. I mean, are they women? Are they human? We don't know. And so it kind of establishes them as supernatural forces. They're chaotic beyond our anything we can comprehend. And therefore, we know they're going to be an evil presence in the play. We also get this personification. The beard itself is personified, which is very strange choice of language technique. The idea that the beard forbids something as if they could talk, but they can't. It almost gives them a sort of metaphorical power and authority, linking to this idea of, at the time, men were associated with dominance and power and anger. And it's almost like the beards are personified as all of that, as all of those things, powerful and angry. And therefore, that emphasizes how disturbing and unnatural their appearance actually is. Even if they have non-human features, um, they speak against the natural logic of the world. And so we can link that to our context then. And again, this is a lot. I get it. It's not easy to understand Macbeth and Shakespeare in general. But these are 6 worthwhile marks, very easy marks to get into the exam. So we can think about, again, the easy the easy path to go down is the Great Chain of Being. Because the witches are pretty much a symbol of that break in cosmic order. They do not represent what is natural in the world. They have an inhuman appearance, and that suggests that they exist outside of the natural hierarchy. They're not fully earthly, but they're not divine either. Their presence is very much, and I can't stress this enough, a violation of the cosmic order. They do not belong on this earth. And therefore, that contributes to how we see them as very unnatural, as almost evil and sinister, and again raises questions of who and what they are and what they want. So their chaos foreshadows disruption, showing that Macbeth is probably going to fall into some sort of downfall. And we can link this back to James I again. He very much believed in witches, and he wanted the audience to believe in witches as well. He wanted to be scared by them. He wanted them to praise him. And so he was very happy that the witches were being portrayed in this way. And then gender. We've talked about gender, but just to reiterate, the witches don't look like women should have looked at that time or what people wanted them to look like. And so because they've gone against this natural idea of what femininity is, it kind of presents them as threatening because they don't go with the natural order. And so therefore, by giving them this power that they shouldn't have, presents them as evil. Again, they don't belong on the earth. They're not a stereotypical domestic woman. They are very much independent. They're disorderly. They're chaotic. All the things that should scare a Jacobean audience. And then therefore their plot devices. They're instigators of disruption. They violate the natural the law. They give prophecies they shouldn't be giving and influence fate where they shouldn't be influencing it. So again, that raises the question of, are they to blame for Macbeth's downfall? That's up to you to decide. Okay, and we'll do one more before we go on to our little break. Yeah, I'm not sure how much time we're going to have for Macbeth today. If we have 10, 15 minutes at the end, I'll make a start and we can continue that next week, looking at specifically Macbeth. But carrying on with Act 1, Scene 3 of The Witches, we looked at the meta. We looked at this quote. They say, though his bark cannot be lost, yet it shall be tempest tossed. Now, what do they mean by this? Bark, at the time, what they're really saying is they're referring to a ship. They're saying, though we can't sink this ship, what we can do is toss it around a little bit. So they're almost presenting this metaphor of a ship at sea. They're saying, okay, we can't kill the people that are on the ship, we can't kill the sailors, But what we can do is influence the weather. So it's kind of linking to that context of they are not the classic fates. They're very limited in what they can do. Essentially, they cannot directly kill, they cannot tell Macbeth what to do. What they can do is influence things into happening. And so this is a massive extended metaphor of the ship. The noun of the bark refers to a small sailing ship. It's saying it's linking humans to fragile vessels. It's saying that very much like ships at sea, humans can be tossed about. We can make them suffer, even if we can't directly kill them. We can throw them off course. We can influence their lives. The witches don't directly kill or command, but they do influence and destabilize. And this evokes a vulnerability, suggesting that people are easily overwhelmed by emotional or external forces, very much like ambition in Macbeth, fate or temptation, again highlighting the moral message of the play. And I hope that you have linked this quote already to a key moment in history. And we'll come on to this, but start thinking about how this maybe reflects King James is the first sail in 1590. But we get this juxtaposition as well, that the bark cannot be lost, yet it shall be tempest tossed. This contrast again, they're saying that we can't sink the ship, but we can very much influence it and try. So that contrast, that juxtaposition, emphasizes how limited they are, essentially. They can only actively control or manipulate, sorry, rather than actively control. And that highlights that theme of fate versus free will. Was Macbeth actually to blame, or was it the witches? Because they never tell him what to do. He still murders Duncan, even though they never tell him to. So is that his fault for having a mental flaw, or is it their fault for putting it in his head in the first place? That's the moral message. Again, it's your call. It's your debate as to what you believe in. I can't give you that answer, but I can help guide you into coming up with that answer. And then we get the modal verbs, so that it shall be tempest tossed. Creates this tone of certainty. Even though they can't sink the ship, even though they can't kill people, they can certainly try and will give it a good go. And so that sort of modal verb of the shall presents them as being inevitable. It's the idea of fate, that they represent fate, that we can't control what we do in life. It's fate is predetermined before we're even born. So this sense of divine command almost shows the witches' power to manipulate, presenting them as ironic and sort of a dark authority. And it's emphasized through the rhyme scheme, which evokes a sense of ritualistic incantation to reinforce that supernatural tone. We also get this sort of plosive alliteration in the imagery of the tempest tossed. So I hope you've noticed that fricative language again, the double T, repeated harsh T sounds. The tempest is a storm. A tempest is where you have a really harsh weather that causes a really bad and serious storm. And by using the sort of like really harsh T sounds, it mimics that violence, that suffering that's created by the storm. And so it adds to this idea that they are very evil characters that we should fear. Because not only can they create the storm, but they can certainly make you suffer for it. So it adds to that harsh and turbulent rhythm that mimics things thrown about by a storm, therefore symbolizing emotional chaos and spiritual torment and lack of control. While the man's bark, his life, cannot be entirely sunk or killed, it can certainly be battered and disorientated, suggesting that the witches deal in mental and moral confusion rather than physical harm. Okay, and then linking this to context then. So the idea of bark, the life of humanity, this great chain. They want, or their goal is to create chaos. They want to make people suffer, whether they can kill them or not. And would you not agree that this is very much a violation of the natural order? It's a violation of God's will, essentially. The witches oppose the divine hierarchy. They act as disruptors of fate that leads towards chaos as it destabilizes the moral and political order. Their will to manipulate human life represents their evil and opposition into God, really highlighting that moral message. Do not play with fire because you will get burnt. Do not put your faith in the supernatural because it will lead to chaos and potentially your own death. This idea that juxtaposition links to the Holinshed Chronicles. Shakespeare changed the original story. Originally, they were manipulators. They could kill people, but now in his story, they can't. So it really highlights and emphasizes that moral question of free will versus fate. Whose fault is it? And then gender as well in the sort of like modal verbs. Again, they're not stereotypical women. They are not passive and domestic. They don't come across as submissive female characters. In fact, they have a lot of power. I mean, they have the power to quite literally manipulate the weather and cause suffering, almost linking them more to male authority. And so it shows again that breaking of the great chain, that they transcend their place, that they are almost satanic, evil characters. Which brings me on to my final point before I break. James the First. I hope you noticed that Shakespeare put this in for a reason. James the First was the king at the time when this play was written. Shakespeare wanted to please the king. And so he referenced James the First's own story of his ship being sunk or trying to be sunk. Um, the Tempest tossed refers quite literally to his voyage in 1590, where his ship encountered severe storms, and he believed the witches had summoned these storms to kill him at sea, triggering the infamous North Berwick witch trials, where dozens were tortured. And Shakespeare draws on this incident to present the witches as quite genuinely threatening. He wanted to reflect public societal fear. He wanted to make people scared, as well as please the king. He wanted to make sure that the audience knew that witches were real, and by validating James I's fears and legitimizing those witch hunts. And so it kind of emphasizes that moral message of the play again. Don't put your faith in the supernatural because you will get hurt and there will be suffering out of it. Um, right. So let's take 5 minutes. If you have any questions, put them in the chat and then we'll finish this off. Sorry, I've been talking a lot about a little today, but I really just want to emphasize to you the importance of these 6 marks in the exam and how easy it is. And I know there's a lot of information. I know my PowerPoint slides are full, but I really wanted to get this across to you. So yeah, screenshot anything you like, ask any questions in the chat, and I am here. And you have 5 minutes. Have a break, and we'll come back. Right. Okay. So yeah, just a quick interlude. So I've had a few questions with stuff that people might want to go over in the future. So just a quick reminder, like these sessions are kind of for you. So if there's anything that people want me to go over, I'm very happy to go over anything. I've not really had many requests in the past few weeks, so I've kind of just been doing my own stuff with Macbeth. But if there's anything, and I've had a few people, but if there's anything you really want me to cover, then yeah, please put it in the chat. So for example, I'm going to kind of go over in the coming weeks how to write thesis and personal statements, looking more at sort of that language side of formal writing. But the only reason I'm focusing heavily on Macbeth is because a few weeks ago, a number of people have asked me to do it. So yeah, if there's anything else, please ask because I'm going to start doing more language as well. So next week, I'm thinking of doing the Macbeth stuff, Act One, and then looking at sort of formal writing. So yes, can you please tell me the key themes and characters that the exam can directly ask? So this is a good question. I actually have this somewhere. If we go back to, let me get this up for you. So yeah, there are a set list of things that are on the syllabus that could come up. Let me get it up for you. So there are on, I think characters wise for Macbeth, there are only four on the syllabus from my knowledge. So that's Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, The Witches, and Banquo. I don't think they would ever ask you about anything else other than those sort of three things. I mean, four things. And then in terms of themes, these are the themes. So the ones that are sort of highlighted in white here are sort of the main ones of the play that could come up. So for example, the question that I showed you for 2023 was about gender, basically. So appearance versus reality. So they could ask you about ambition. This year's question was about ambition. It was about the character of Macbeth and his ambition. There was, it could be about power. There's a massive power dynamic throughout Macbeth. It could be about fate versus the free will. This question of do you believe that it's his fault or the witches, or is it Lady Macbeth's fault? Um, Appearance versus reality, deception. Throughout the play, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth do deceive a lot of people. It could be about being two-faced and being different behind closed doors. This idea of violence could come up. I've not seen violence yet come up, or it might have come up a few years ago. It's only come up once if it has. So that could come up. And when we start to look at Macbeth as a character, and I think we'll do next week now, I will look at violence because Act One is very heavy on the importance of violence. And then guilt could come up as well. And that's definitely not come up yet. And I thought that was going to be this year's question. Everyone thought it was going to be guilt. So could be next year's, or has a very high chance of being next year's question. But it will come up at some point because these are the ones that are named on the syllabus. And anything other than these, I don't think would come up. And then same with the characters. Okay. So back to our question at hand. Let's move on. So that was kind of like Act One, Scene One, and Act One, Scene Three. Um, the witches' first appearances, where they give the prophecies to Banquo and Macbeth. However, they appear again later in the play, in Act 3, Scene 5. So this is their third out of four appearances. And contextually, this is an important scene because, as I kind of briefly alluded to at the beginning, and I went over a few weeks ago, this scene was not in the original play, or we don't think it was in the original version of the play. We think this might have been added by another writer later down the line, purely for a few reasons. One, that the tone is different. There's an introduction to a new character called Hecate that is not in the rest of the play. Um, but it is there for a few reasons. So what happens basically in this scene is that the witches come together and they meet a character called Hecate. And Hecate is sort of the goddess of evil and witchcraft. And she basically scorns the witches. She basically has a go at them and says, why did you make Macbeth do all of these violent, horrible things? You shouldn't be influencing his fate. He's only human. You shouldn't have this power. Um, and so it kind of really emphasizes the moral message of the play. because it kind of makes their motivations more clear as characters, that they're there to create chaos. Um, so yeah, it really emphasizes that moral message of the play of don't play with fire, you're gonna get burnt. Don't play with the supernatural because you're gonna end up in chaos and death. And so she basically instructs the witches to give Macbeth three apparitions, and influence him back on track in terms of his life trajectory. And so there's not really many key quotes for this section, but I would highlight these three and we'll go through one of them. So, how did you dare to trade and traffic with Macbeth in riddle and affairs of death? So, this roughly translates in kind of what I was saying. She's saying, how dare you manipulate or try to manipulate Macbeth's human life by giving him these prophecies of riddles and affairs, is basically what she's saying. And which is worse, all you have done hath been but for a wayward son. He shall spurn fate, scorn death, and bear his hopes but above wisdom, grace, and fear. Again, this is scorning the witches. Um, she's basically saying, like, he shall spurn fate. He's going against his fate, and he shouldn't be. He should be very much following fate. And so it kind of highlights this fate versus free will. He's going to scorn death. He's doing all of these murderous things that he should not be doing. Um, and then you all know security is mortal's chiefest enemy, and this is the one we're going to look at. So you all know security is mortal's chiefest enemy. Now, what she's saying here is security is basically a metaphor for overconfidence, for our hubris and pride. So what she's saying is kind of highlighting the moral message of the play. Really, this is the moral message of the play. She's saying that overconfidence and arrogance is humans' own worst enemy. Having too much overconfidence and hubris will lead to your downfall, is what she's saying here. And so we've got this sort of abstract now of the security that symbolizes a state of mind. It's not literal security. It's not talking about like safety. It's talking about overconfidence. She's saying if you have too much pride, you're gonna end up with a terrible fate. And so it's this sort of metaphoric idea of hubris. And she uses it ironically, to be honest, because she's emphasizing how dangerous it can be, which is the moral message of the play. The audience need to learn from this moment. You know, people who are overconfident become complacent, they become vulnerable, um, just as much as overconfidence can protect you. And so this sort of emphasizes again the moral message of the play. It highlights that Macbeth's flaw is his hubris, is his pride. And then we also kind of get this semantic field. So the overconfidence and the chiefest. This idea of war, which almost presents the witches as all a bit predatory. It really makes their motivations clear that they are evil supernatural forces. They are predatory. So the chiefest kind of gives warlike imagery. Kind of think like in battle, you get like generals who sort of lead battalions. This idea of being the chief, the one in charge, presents overconfidence as almost like a leader in battle. So if we were to talk about, if you did get a question about violence, this could be linked to violence almost, because it's almost talking about how violence can be of the mind, it can be metaphorical just as much as it can be literal, sort of like suffering violence. You know, it's something that can be avoided or feared. Otherwise, it can destroy you. And this sort of foreshadows Macbeth's fatal downfall. Again, this idea of the enemy, this like war imagery, that overconfidence and hubris is your metaphorical enemy. It's presented with human-like qualities, this sort of personification as sort of an enemy. It presents the struggles of mankind, reinforces that moral message. It gives overconfidence a cosmic context, presenting it as an overwhelming force which foreshadows Macbeth's downfall and inability to repent, to seek forgiveness and salvation. And ironically, he is now kind of an enemy of God by doing these violent, horrible things. And he's too far gone for forgiveness and salvation. So this kind of links to our peripeteia, because his peripeteia was Act 3, Scene 4. This is now one scene after. We're still in that realm of the reversal of fortune where things have begun to change for him as a character. So it's that question of, is it too late for him to seek forgiveness? And then again, we get this like superlative, the chiefest. emphasizing that hubris and overconfidence is the worst danger of all. Now, the fact that the witches are saying it, or like a goddess is saying this, because that's what she is a goddess of war. The fact that this god is telling you quite outright, stating to you as an audience member that overconfidence is a sin, it's a bad thing, is supposed to make the audience think it's a bad thing. You're supposed to go away from this, having learned something, and not wanting to commit sin. It's the point of the play. And therefore links to sort of the Great Chain. So if we link this to context, then we can think about the religious aspects of this. So we get a religious allusion here. So we're linking or making us think of something related to the Bible. So Hecate is our goddess of war. And she's seen as a sort of the satanic figure. Uh, she sort of manipulates. And that makes us think, as the audience member, back to the Bible, kind of this idea of the devil. Thinking back to the Garden of Eden, we have the snake that influences events. The snake never tells Eve or Adam to take the apple. He simply manipulates and influences. So, like Lucifer or the serpent in the Garden of Eden, she understands that hubris or pride is the root of all sin. And she encourages Macbeth's tragic downfall. This allusion back to the Bible would really resonate with the audience. Hubris blinds Macbeth from moral truth and repentance, which is required for salvation. It's required to get into heaven. So by not repenting and seeking forgiveness, she's saying that Macbeth's not going to get into heaven, basically. He's too far gone to be forgiven by God. So hubris blinds Macbeth from moral truth and repentance. And his false security leads him into a downfall, into eternal damnation in hell when he dies. We can also think contextually about the witches and as Hecate as plot devices. Her criticism reveals that the witches aren't just purely mischievous. They're there for a reason. They have a strategic purpose, and that is to lead human mortals into self-destruction. They're there to create chaos. Hecate plans to trick Macbeth through illusion. He tells the witches to present him with three apparitions, reinforcing their roles as catalysts for chaos rather than direct agents of evil. The Great Chain of Being as well. She's saying that overconfidence causes people to forget their place and given by God. Therefore, it's going to lead to chaos. It's going to lead to suffering and injury. And Macbeth's rising ambition, very much bolstered by the witch's manipulations, lead him to commit the murder of Duncan, which is a direct attack on the Great Chain of Being and the Divine Right of Kings. Because if you think back, the king was chosen by God. He was God's representative on earth. And so killing the king was not only a legal crime, but a spiritual one as well. So in doing so, he breaks the natural order and forgets his station. So Hecate's quote here is a moral warning to the audience. Don't play with the supernatural, you're gonna get chaos and hurt. And then finally, this scene in itself, like I said, was not in the original play. This was added later down the line. We think it was. And the reason that we think it might be is because it reveals true intent. It's not simply to predict fate, but to manipulate directly a downfall of our protagonist. So by exploiting his growing overconfidence, it really repositions the witches as active agents of destruction, using sort of false security to blind Macbeth to danger. And this not only makes their motivations clearer, but establishes societal fears, reinforces a moral message, as Hecate adds an additional cosmic layer to emphasize the consequences of defying a divine order. Okay, let me just check the chat. Can I talk about poets? Yeah, we can come on to poetry. I've had a few requests of various things. So the things that I have been asked to cover are like personal statements, like how to write personal statements, basically, which we can do in terms of language. I also got asked about Jekyll and Hyde. So if that's something that appeals to people, yeah, please put that in the chat as well. And now you've asked for poetry. So yeah, I have a few things. I'll work something out, but I'm thinking of doing Jekyll and Hyde before poetry, just because more people do Jekyll and Hyde compared to the poetry, and there's a lot more poems to cover than there is Jekyll and Hyde content. So yeah, but I want to go through Macbeth first, or at least the character of Macbeth, which I'm going to start doing. So let me know, because I'm thinking of basically doing an hour of language and an hour of literature. So if that's something people would like, yeah, put that in the chat. But anyway, so Act 4, Scene 1 is the final time we see the witches. And in this scene, they give Macbeth three apparitions to do with floating heads. And that sends Macbeth into a bit of a final spiral about his future. And it makes him very worried and uncertain because they're trying to correct Macbeth's fate, basically. But it just sends him into a spiral that ultimately um, leads him down a further path of guilt. And so we get quotes like double, double, toiling trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog. Now, this is one that you will probably heard. This is a very famous quote. And when we think about witches, we tend to think of this quote. And it comes from the scene in Macbeth. We won't cover the analysis directly of this quote, so I appeal to you to have a think about it on your own. Think about why we've used certain language, like why do we have that semantic field of animals? Why again have we got this rhyming couplet? So we get the cauldron bubble, the newt, the toe of frog. Why is this unnatural language used? By pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. A sweltered venom like a hell broth boil. Beware Macduff, beware the Thane of Fife, none of women born shall harm Macbeth. We're not going to cover that quote directly, but it's really key to the plot. So they give the warning to Macbeth to beware Macduff. Um, he says, none of women born shall harm Macbeth. And they trick Macbeth here because they basically say they get him to think that only a man could kill him. And so Macbeth kind of begins to spiral and begins to panic that he's going to be murdered by some form of man. But what he doesn't realize is that Macbeth was actually born by cesarean, which means he never actually was born in a natural way. And so at the end, Macduff can actually kill Macbeth. And yeah, we'll cover that more later when we look at Act 5 specifically. But okay, so let's look at the quote specifically. Sweltered venom like a hell broth boil. Someone asked, can you do some Macbeth quotes? Yes, yes, I can. I had planned for this week to start looking at Macbeth specifically as a character, but timing wise, just hasn't worked out. So I'm going to start doing that next week. I've already done a lesson plan on specifically Act 1 of Macbeth as a character. So we'll kind of pick it apart act by act because he's kind of the main protagonist. So it makes more sense to do that. But yes, I can. Um, and I even might start that in the last 10 minutes if we have time, but otherwise next week. And I'm going to work through the characters. So bear with me. I focused a lot on the witches, but this could come up. And this is the last quote we'll go through. So sweltered venom like a hell broth boil. If something swelters, think about in heat. Humans don't do well in heat. When we are in intense heat, we tend to get a lot of inflammation. You get red skin. Sometimes your fingers get wider. That's swelling. It's basically when our skin starts to sort of become really inflamed. So I don't know about you, sometimes I wear rings all the time. Sometimes in really hot weather, my fingers kind of inflame and they get bigger and then my rings get stuck. That's sweltering. So this idea of like linking to the body. So firstly, we'll pick up the venom. Venom linking to a poisonous animal, particularly makes you think of maybe a snake, which we can again link back to the Garden of Eden, the snake that tempted Adam and Eve to eat the apple and go against God's will. So we get this illusion. Illusion is when you link back to something that the audience should already know. So this noun venom becomes a symbol of moral and spiritual corruption as it alludes to that snake who tempted humanity into sin. You know, the witches too, like that snake, tempt Macbeth into sin. They lead him to commit violent acts. You know, and the metaphor of this poison adds almost a sensory layer to this idea as it portrays an uncomfortable fate, highlighting ideas of death. So it's a very interesting choice of noun. We also kind of get this semantic feel of heat, like I was saying, so the sweltering, the boiling. Thinking back to the Great Chain, this is a very unnatural sort of source of imagery. And so we get this sensory imagery to evoke connotations of almost oppression. Think like when we're in really intense heat, we're meant to get a heat wave next week. And we have, like last week, it got really hot at one point. And when you're in really hot weather, sometimes, especially at night, sometimes you can really struggle to sleep because it's just so hot in your room. And that makes you feel almost very uncomfortable because you're just tossing and turning and you can't get to sleep. And even when it's really hot in the day, you just want to be in the shade because it's just so uncomfortable and unsettling. That's that feeling of oppression. You almost feel like it's trapping you. And so the fact that we've got this semantic field of heat presents a very oppressive tone. Therefore, linking to Macbeth as a character. He's losing control over his own body, his own mind. It portrays connotations of transformation. And it foreshadows his downfall towards his death, his catastrophe, as it were, and highlights the theme of violence, if nothing else. And then we get the simile, like a hell broth boil, the linking to the hell. Again, this religious imagery. When we think about a hell, we think about literal heat. We also think about horror. We think about suffering. So Shakespeare likens their potion to something demonic, directly linking them to satanic forces. And this would resonate very strongly with the Jacobean audience, um, because they were very steeped in Christian belief. Therefore, reinforcing the idea that witches are doing the devil's work. And this noun of the hell underscores damnation, moral corruption. And then we have that sort of plosive alliteration to really tie this and emphasize everything I've just said. So the broth boil. The plosive here is that repeated B sound. And plosive means something that's very hard hitting. So you get your B's, your D's, your P's. And they're all used to reflect violence of some sort. So the fact that that Shakespeare's chosen this specific plosive alliteration mimics the heat or the oppressive feeling of the heat that we've just kind of mentioned. It creates an auditory image that reinforces the settling and almost chaotic tone of the sea. And therefore, it symbolizes the growing intensity and volatility of the events to come. Okay. Then finally, linking this to context, then we get this religious illusion. So an illusion, like I said, is when you link back to something the audience would know of. So in this case, it's the serpent. This venom makes us think of a poisonous animal, and we tend to think more of snakes than anything else. And at the time, Britain was very Christian, and so they would have been heavily aware of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve story. And even nowadays, when we think of the Bible and the stories, we tend to think of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden more than anything else. We're very heavily aware that the snake is almost a symbol of deception now. And so this religion illusion evokes that sense of deception and danger because Macbeth is tempted by the witch's visions, which is what leads him into moral collapse, much like how the snake tempts Eve to eat the apple. And this illusion would have been very easily recognized by a Jacobean audience, for whom the snake symbolized the root of all human sin. We also kind of get this idea of salvation in terms of religion. So in Christian belief, the path to salvation requires repentance. It requires humility and obedience to God. And this scene, however, shows the witches concocting a potion that leads to Macbeth further into delusion and sin. Shakespeare presents the witches as satanic tempters, actively leading Macbeth away from salvation and towards eternal damnation into hell. And the cauldron becomes a symbol of the original sin. And then it kind of links to the divine right and the great chain. Because like I've said throughout this whole thing, the witches are supposed to represent chaos. They go against the natural God-given order of the earth. The witch's brew physically represents unnatural forces that go against the divine law. They tell us a moral message. They should convey to the audience not to play with fire because you will get hurt. Don't play with the supernatural because there will be chaos and death. So by turning to them for guidance rather than God and his own conscience, it positions Macbeth as being outside salvation, violating both his moral duty and the cosmic order. And then for the first time, we do kind of get mention of the witches in terms of the four humours. When we think of venom, When you think of a snake, I don't know if you've ever watched a video of how snake venom works, but when it gets into your blood, it can kind of congeal it and it can stop it from flowing around your body. So we have this sort of like violent imagery there as well. And in terms of for humans, someone that was high in blood was someone who was kind and generous and passionate, um, which is ironic because Macbeth has committed all of these violent acts and is certainly not described as kind. And so the fact that they've used, or Shakespeare has used, this particular venomous imagery shows that his humor's out of balance, that he has been corrupted, that his blood, his kindness, his metaphorical kindness, has been replaced by rage and violence. He's been poisoned, which therefore again links to our fate or free will. Is it the witch's fault, or is it Macbeth's for already being somewhat evil? So this therefore foreshadows his tragic downfall, hinting that they may be too late for salvation. Because when even, I mean, most venom, let's say most, um, when you get bitten by a venomous snake, most often than not, you cannot cure it or heal it, and you are fated to die. And so it's a very interesting, unique use of imagery here. And I love this quote for that reason, because there's so many layers to it. You know, like the venom, this metaphorical corruption of the mind cannot be restored. Macbeth is fated to die now. He's irreversible. He's fated to live his eternity in hell. He cannot repent and be forgiven by God. And that's shown through the physical poisoning of the venom. It's very interesting, and therefore links to his tragic peripeteia. It's too late for him to seek repentance. Okay, so as a final thing we'll look at then is example answers, and what kind of things you could write for this kind of question. So we looked at one before, and I'll go back to it at the end. If you want to submit the one from earlier as homework, and I'll put it up at the end, please do. But otherwise, starting with this extract, explore how Shakespeare presents the witches and their influence on others. Just to highlight, this is not your homework question. This is just what I'm going to quickly look at. But write about how Shakespeare presents the witches in this extract and how Shakespeare presents the witches in the whole play. Let's imagine the extract is Act 1, Scene 3, where Banquo and Macbeth see the witches on the heath for the first time and they give them the prophecies. Now, looking at the mark scheme, I've highlighted for you what you would need or is expected of you to get the higher level answers. So when we talk about AO1, we're talking about making points. So in order to get that higher band, they expect you to be critical, explanatory, and conceptualized in your response, thinking about the task and the wider text. And they expect you to be judicious about using precise references. So what they mean by judicious is picking a range of quotes. Have you been able to make multiple points and back them up with multiple quotes accurately? Have you made unique points that you've clearly explained? In terms of AO2, they're looking at language and structural analysis. So I can't stress to you enough that even though this is not language, please mention terminology because you get marked on it. So personification, metaphors, juxtaposition, all of the structural techniques, please mention them because you get marked on them here. In fact, you get marked 12 out of 30 marks on them. So they want you to analyze writers' methods with accurate subject terminology, used judiciously. Again, this range of judicious, is it accurate? Have you used a wide range that's accurate? Have you explored the effects of the writer's intentions to create meanings? Why has Shakespeare made specific choices? And then AO3 is context, which you get 6 out of 30 marks for. So exploring ideas and perceptives of contextual factors. So all of the divine right and great chain of being and Act 3, Scene 5, everything that we've covered. And linking specifically to the task at hand. So let's look, and I've done a lovely color helping for you to understand where everything in our PTEC paragraph, that's point, evidence, terminology, explaining context. And I've highlighted it all for you. And I want to just emphasize as well, this whole thing is not going to get you 26 out of 30. This is just 1 point out of maybe 3 or 4. But if you wrote the same sort of quality, you would get about 26, basically. So don't just think this one is going to get you 26, because it's not. This is only part of the answer. So, remember our question: how do they present the witches and their influence on others? Well, in this extract, Shakespeare presents the witches as manipulative and malevolent forces who, while limited in their power, exert psychological and spiritual influence over human lives. So that is our point. They've gone straight in with the point. The first witches claim that his bark cannot be lost, yet it shall be tempest tossed. There's our quote, uses an extended nautical metaphor to represent the vulnerability of human beings. The bark, or small ship, symbolizes the sailor's life and its inability to be lost, juxtaposingly reflecting a boundary to the witch's power, perhaps implying the soul is protected by divine authority. This highlights the theme of fate versus free will within the play, as it establishes the witches as the destructive force whilst limiting their direct influence over Macbeth's fate. This diversion from the original Holinshed Chronicle source material not only places the fear in the audience, but leaves them to question the extent to which his tragic downfall is a result of supernatural force or human flaw, enabling an introspective reflectance in the audience. So I started to make a detailed explanation linking it to context. And despite their limitations, the witches are presented as powerful, as the modal verb shall evokes certainty, suggesting the witch's confidence in their ability to inflict suffering, even if they cannot directly kill. In conjunction, the storm imagery and fricative alliteration created in Tempest Tossed mimics the violent rhythm of a storm, reinforcing their power to destabilize human consciousness and foreshadowing the violence that will later occur as a result of their deception. Now, contextually, Shakespeare alludes to the tempestuous journey taken by James I in 1590, who believed supernatural forces were attempting to kill him. This would instill fear in the audience as the event led to mass torture. Moreover, it also foreshadows Macbeth's downfall by portraying the consequences of committing sinful behavior, which inevitably lead to chaos, thus encouraging the audience to remain within their divine given place in the great chain of being. Now, this isn't by no means a perfect answer, but what it has begun to do is critically explore this idea that, on one hand, they've said, down here, I've said, yeah, they are powerful. However, their power is limited. That's critical. I've not just said, yes, they're powerful or no, they're not powerful. I've said, yeah, they're kind of powerful. However, they could also be seen as this. That is critical. Um, I would say I've used judicious in this case, but I have looked at the whole quote. So this is where maybe it's not 30 out of 30 because you could link it to another quote. I could have made it more conceptualized, but that would have come with a full answer. AO2, I've definitely started to use, or I have done a solid pick of subject terminology. I've talked about juxtaposition, symbolism, alliteration, imagery, modal verbs. I've really gone to town with looking at the writer's methods and using accurate subject terminology. And I've linked it to context. I've talked about why Shakespeare moved away from the original source material and how it would have made the reader feel, the audience feel based on the knowledge they would have had about the journey. Now, the last thing we'll do, let's look at an answer that maybe wouldn't get so high. And again, I want to stress there's only one paragraph. So this is not the entire answer. So in this extract, Shakespeare shows that the witches can cause trouble for people, even if they cannot kill them. The first witch says his bark cannot be lost, yet it shall be tempest tossed. The word bark is a metaphor for a ship, meaning that the man's life will be thrown into a storm. This shows that witches have power to make people suffer. And the use of the word tempest makes the storm sound violent and dangerous. And the witches are speaking in rhyme and rhythm, which makes their speech sound like a spell. This makes them seem scary and supernatural. Now, at the time of the play was written, people believed that witches were real and could cause storms. King James I thought witches had tried to kill him at sea, so this line would remind the audience of that. Shakespeare makes the witches seem evil and powerful, which would make the audience feel fear and show how they could influence people like Macbeth. Now, I've highlighted on the right why this maybe didn't get as high, so I would put this here. I mean, they've started to use terminology. They've labeled the metaphor. I think that might be all they used, but they did start to label it and it was accurate. They could have talked about the noun of the bark. They could have talked about it in terms of other language devices. They did comment on the response, like it wasn't irrelevant, it was actually related to the response. It did support the task. And there was some awareness of contextual ideas. So, for example, they linked it to how it made the audience feel knowing about King James's journey. So that's why it would have been here. But certainly, his first answer is more detailed, certainly more accurate terminology, more quote analysis, and more of a conceptualized critical approach, whereas this one is pretty much only given one side of the argument. So my tips then, just going forward, is try to think about multiple sides of the argument here. Don't just try and go in with one view. I'm really going to town with language analysis because it's 12 out of 30, and it's so easy to pick out metaphors and juxtaposition. So please do that because you get marked on it, and even linking it to context. So I would even argue that literature is easier than language because in language, they expect more of you in terms of analysis, but in literature, most of the marks are for literally stating context and analyzing language devices. So um, that's it. So this, I'm going to restate to you that this is optional. You don't have to do it. I can't track who does and doesn't do it. But if you want to send me an answer, please do. Because as I said before, I'm happy to mark anything you want to send to me. And I know some people have sent me some stuff, and I will get to it this week, and I promise I will get it back to you. But yeah, please do. I encourage you because it would be helpful, in my opinion, to you. So this is the question if you want to answer. Try to use quotes that I've not gone through, because there were quite a few. I want to see you try and attempt to analyze language features and structural features and linking it to the context. And again, if you want to go through context in detail, my session 2 weeks ago should still be on YouTube somewhere if you want it. Okay, right. Before I go, let me answer what is in the chat. Okay, someone asked what is P-TECH. So I don't know if you've come to my previous sessions before. When I've talked about language, I've talked about PETA. So that's point, evidence, terminology, explain, reader. But when we think about literature, we more think about replacing the R with a C. And so instead of thinking about the reader, think about context. So point is, what is the point? What is the writer trying to convey to you as an audience member? Evidence is the quotes. So have you picked a range of quotes to support your points? Evidence, oh, sorry, no, terminology. So this is our language analysis. Is there a metaphor in there? Is it personification? Is it juxtaposition? Is it an oxymoron? Um, what's the rhyming structure like? So have you directly named terminology? Explain why has the writer done or made those choices? What does the reader feel because of this? Or sorry, the audience feel because of this? What is the significance of using this technique? And then linking it to context. So everything we've kind of looked at this week and a few weeks ago. So that's what it is. It's basically a structure of how to write a paragraph. And then do you have to mention themes? Can you be marked down for not mentioning them? You don't have to mention them, no. Um, you might get asked about them in the question, like you asked earlier. So you could be asked about a specific theme. Um, and if you are asked about a specific theme, then yes, do mention them. Otherwise you won't be answering the question appropriately. But if you're not asked about a specific theme, you don't have to mention them. They're just, but they are kind of classed as terminology. So it wouldn't harm you to mention them, but you certainly wouldn't get marked down for not mentioning them, if that makes sense. So yeah, you don't have to. Has anyone else got any other questions? If not, that's it for today. And then, yeah, please come back next week. I'm thinking I'll look at personal statements, how to write thesis statements, and then we'll begin to look at specifically the character of Macbeth in Act 1, as well as thesis statements. So please come back if that is something you think would help. And then in the meantime, if you think of anything throughout the week that you think I should cover, send an email. So what is PETA? PETA is, I'd say, not applicable to literature. If you were to answer a language question, so that is point, evidence, explain, point, evidence, terminology, explain, and reader. So if you were answering a language question, it was like, how is the writer use language to describe the garden? You might say, point is the garden has been described as a supernatural force of evil. Evidence, adding in a quote. Terminology is the garden has been personified and it's been given I don't know, animalistic imagery that makes it seem evil. because the it's just been described as having claws or something, and then explaining why has the writer personified the garden to make it seem evil. Then linking it to the reader. How does the reader feel because of this? What are we supposed to take away from that? But I would do P-Tech in terms of um, thinking about literature. Okay, right. That's it for today. Thank you all for coming again. Please come back next week. And yeah, again, in the meantime, if you have anything that you want me to cover, contact the company, contact me. But otherwise, have a nice week, guys, and I'll see you next week.